and welcome to Vocis. My name is Tom Gerhardt and I am the creator of this channel. This channel covers the interviews of contemporary witnesses, mainly but not only of the World War II era. I believe that we can learn much more from those individuals that have lived through those very difficult times in history than we can learn from celebrities and their lifestyles. That being said, I want to introduce you to my first interviewee, Edward William Bullock, who was a very dear friend of mine, who I have met in Normandy back in 2015. So, please enjoy a peek back in time. Well, I'm sitting here with Edward William Bullock. He's 89 years old and a World War II veteran. He was born in Paddington, London, on the 3rd of January 1926. Correct. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. You landed on Gold Beach on D-Day, yes. 6th of June 1944.
Yes.
Did you live in an apartment or did you live in a house?
No, my father was a regular soldier, and that period of time we were living in married quarters, which is known as married quarters for army servicemen.
Okay, yes. Okay, your father was a World War I veteran, right?
My father was a World War I veteran, and he was a sergeant signaller.
Okay.
You know, a sergeant, a sergeant communications.
Yes.
Signaller.
Okay, so he fought against the Germans in France, right?
In France, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Could you describe how living was back then, in the 30s? You know,
it was back in the 30s. Well, things were very, very tough. Having been a family with 11 children, my father was hardly ever there because he was in the army.
Yes.
And my grandfather was also in the military, who served in India for 15 years, and he went astray, and his wife left him. So when my father was away all the time, he helped my mother to bring us up, you know, brought us up in that
yes.
family. And
you also mentioned you actually had 13 brothers and sisters, but
14. Well,
3 of them.
3 died.
Yes.
Which was two girls and 1 boy.
Why did they die?
We didn't run in diphtheria. In other words, really lack of nourishment, as you can put it down to.
Okay.
Lack of so many children.
Yes. Okay, so that was quite common that some died back then.
It was pretty common in that period of time because yes. If you didn't work, you didn't eat.
How did you get notice of the German attack on Poland? You know, when did you heard of that the first time?
Well, we heard of that for the first time was in 1939.
Yes.
Our Prime Minister at that time was Neville Chamberlain, and he already had a conference with Hitler, who first of all attacked Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
And they said, but he was talking to Hitler, talking to Chamberlain, he said that would be it because the majority of the population are German speaking.
Yes.
So we regarded that it's really part of Germany. We first heard about that. Well, first of all, Chamberlain, we heard on the little radio that we had. At that time, Hitler agreed to talking to Chamberlain that he would not attack.
Yes.
Czechoslovakia. And so that was, he came back from Germany, had a bit of paper in his hand and waved it to the crowd saying, peace in our time, Hitler has agreed he will not attack Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
It never said anything about taking any action, but the next day, Hitler broke his word and attacked Czechoslovakia.
Yeah. Well, he just took it, right? I mean,
And he just took it, and
yeah.
just marched in. And then Chamberlain went back to Hitler and had another conference and says to Hitler, if you attack Poland, you declaring war on Britain, and France and Britain and Poland made a pact.
Yes.
That if anyone were attacked, they would defend each other.
Yes. Okay.
And that was agreed, and Hitler said, no, I agree 100%, I will not attack Poland. So anyway, and he came back, saying that I've got peace in our time, Hitler's not going to attack Poland. Well, but in the next week or so, he attacked Poland.
Yes.
So then he came back and stated, we are now at war with Germany.
Okay. So did your parents tell you that, or did you just randomly hear it somewhere?
But my father was already called up in the army at the time.
Yes. What did he do there?
Well, he was training signallers, he was training signallers
Yes.
immediately, because he was hardly trained, and he had the most tremendous reputation in the British Army, because he was given the medal of the highest award for taking into training 40 men to train them for signallers, and out of the 40, he'd actually trained up and passed 40 men.
Okay, cool.
So it was
Yes.
exceptionally, hard, and of course, by doing that in the meantime, in part of his family, but that really was teaching, helping him to teach young soldiers the Morse code and semaphore, with the sat flags.
Yeah.
And the Morse code. Because we all knew the Morse code when we was only 10 years old, not all of us did, because we played a game of battleships and cruisers with a ship of base in them, and we say a certain number, which is a sort of game my father dreamed up.
Yes.
And you say A1, 2, 4, and we'd say in Morse code.
Okay.
And
cool.
so we were playing a sort of bit of a war game in that period of time, and my two brothers, or my eldest brother then, he was going on 17 years old, and he was already trained signaller. He could read Morse code at 21 words a minute. So then, when the war broke out, my brother hated the army, and so in the meantime, at the time, my brother had a tremendous argument with my father, because my mother was again pregnant with another baby, which was the 11th.
No.
And he turned around and my father, he says, it's time you laid off mother, and my father kicked him out. So he was kicked out on his own, so he was living with a friend, he volunteered for the Navy, and when the war started, he had two calling up papers, one for the Navy and one for the Army. But the Navy came first, and when the military police came to pick him up, he was already in the Navy.
Oh, okay.
And so that's another piece of that particular period of time.
Yes.
And of course, then we were stationed at Dover, and we got up on a cliff top, and we saw all these tiny little ships sailing out to Dunkirk.
Yes.
And as I said, we saw all that evacuation of Dunkirk and bringing the soldiers back. And in time, my father went into the docks to help unloading the men without his rifle and without ammunition. And he took from them coming back 100 rounds of 303 ammunition and a 303 rifle. And he went back to the Maori quarters. In the meantime, we dug a trench outside the Maori quarters and covered it, for corrugated iron, a bit like a protected. He had my brother who had him in the army, but since he wasn't only not 18, he pulled him out of the army, and he says, now, you can, when the Germans land, you will defend the family. So he had 100 rounds of ammunition and a 303 rifle. And of course, psychologically, we felt safe.
Yes.
And that morning, the air raid siren went. No, in that night, the air raid siren went, and they had anti-aircraft guns on each side of the hill at Dover. And they opened fire, and in the shelter, with the bomb we'd made, and the shrapnel from the guns falling down on the top of our shelter. We thought it was the bombs were dropping, but it wasn't, because the actual warning with the radar picked up a swarm of birds that was, I don't know what bird it was, the one with the long necks, and they picked up, and it wasn't an attack at that time. It was a flock of birds.
Yeah.
And of course my brother Peter was out there with his 303 rifle looking at, in case the Germans landed. You could imagine we were being blown to smithereens.
Yes.
But psychologically we felt safe.
Yes.
And then...
So you were 15 at that time, right?
I was 16.
Mm.
About 15 to 16. And of course then the Germans started to shell from France with long-range guns, and down in the town itself, this whole block of flats would just disappear. So my father decided we must get out from Dover and go back to our council house,
Yes.
So that's what we did. So when we got on the train to go back
To London, yes.
London, but when we hit Waterloo Station, it came over on the loudspeaker. Came over on the loudspeaker, Churchill's famous speech, and in his famous speech, he turned around and said, "We will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the lanes and the villages, and we will fight in the towns and the cities, and we will choke in our own blood, but we will never, ever, ever surrender."
So you actually heard it live?
Yes.
Like, okay.
We will choke in our own blood. The oratory and speech was so inspiring that at that time I joined the Home Guard, and all we had was a little band, and all we had to, because all the equipment was lost, and we trained with broomsticks.
Yes.
So we trained with broomsticks and marched up and down and started preparing ourselves for the invasion.
So you actually thought Germany's going to invade Great Britain?
And no question about it. Everybody thought it was a matter of time, and everybody's nerves were like violin strings because we were going to be invaded.
Okay, so, okay.
And in that period of time, Germany had actually built up an invasion force.
Yes.
Who actually started the invasion, but Hitler wouldn't give the go-ahead until he had air superiority. And
that's where the Battle of Britain started, right?
The Battle of Britain started, and fortunate for us, we held. And Hitler made a tremendous mistake, because Churchill tactically went and dropped a few bombs on Berlin, which did very little damage, but so upset Hitler that Hitler turned around and said, "I will wipe London off the face of the earth." And that's what he tried to do. And on the first wave, it was such a shock and surprise that 500 bombers in daylight hit London,
yes,
and started fires in the docks of London, and a particular factory which was the sugar factory, Tainton Lives, burned continuously for 3 weeks. And the whole of London docks were on fire.
Where were you at that time?
I was in London,
Yes.
in an air raid shelter.
Okay.
And then we evacuated down into the tubes underground, previous. But we didn't at that time, it was in the open. But we prepared ourselves previously. 45% of all children from London were evacuated in 1939, as soon as the war was declared.
Yes.
Were evacuated the country, and mostly was grown-up people in London when we called it the Blitzkrieg hit us.
Yes. Could you try to describe the feeling of being bombed? What could you try to describe that?
Well, it's being young at the time, the feeling was of excitement.
Okay.
At the time we were excited. But when you looked up to the sky and see all these planes coming over, and then you see these things falling out of them, you didn't realise that they were bombs. And of course, when they hit us, we were absolutely terrified.
Yeah.
Really and truly terrified.
Yeah, I believe that,
And
yes.
we were absolutely terrified, and we got into the shelters, and we had built a shelter called an Anderson shelter, which was an oval corrugated looking like a type of shed, and just an opening in the front, and covered with earth.
Yes.
That was built we built them in the gardens. Well, on the first attack, we was actually in our air raid shelters in the garden for the first attack.
Did all of your family fit in there? They're pretty tight, aren't they?
No, we had such a big family that we had a double-sized shelter.
Oh, okay.
Which was, instead of putting it back on the normal one, we had 2.
Yeah.
And it was a longer one extended with the back on then.
Okay.
And we had wooden beds in them, and we also put electric lighting in. But luckily we were so amateurish, but we were lucky we wasn't all electrocuted.
Yes.
In that period of time, and as I say, and we were so shocked. But when we'd come out from the shelter, it was in the evening time, and the next minute the siren went again, and we were hammered again, exactly the same, with another 500 bombers that night.
Okay.
And for 2 days we were literally, really and truly. And the next day, you see the whole rows of shops would be blasted out, and they would have a notice in them, we have been reopened, and the shops were absolutely blasted out, but there's no notice bottom saying, business as usual, we have been reopened.
Yeah.
And they said, and it was just like that, that period. And then the biggest uplift was, in that period, it continued night and day, the bombing, for 8 months. And the biggest morale booster of the time was our Queen Mother came down and says to us, you East Enders, I can now face you because my house has been bombed, when half of Buckingham Palace was knocked down.
Yes.
And bombed.
Oh.
So she was in a small hut with this group on the street and served us cups of tea. Queen Mother.
Have you seen her?
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
Oh,
we
yeah.
actually, and then she came down the street. At that time she was in the street, and it was the biggest shock for us. There's the Queen Mother, and she could have so easily run away to Canada or in that time,
Yes.
and gone to a safe place, but she did not. She stood by us, and that what helped to keep our morale high and take the punishment, And on the first wave, there was thousands killed, and 150 survived, was in a big hall from what they had for entertainment. But now 200 people, and the buses couldn't get in the streets because it was all debris. Couldn't get to them. But that night, with another 500 bombers, you know, that was in there, and the whole lot was killed.
Okay,
You know,
yes.
if they'd only got the bus to them, they would have been evacuated. But it wasn't to be, and it was all, they all died.
Did you know somebody, or did you lose friends during the bombing?
Lots of neighbours, friends,
Yeah.
yes, and it was, but in the old traditional East End funerals was white horses and carts, but that at a period of time was things that have passed. It was just loaded up in mainly a horse and cart on the back of it, and taken to the cemetery and buried in a mass grave, you know.
Yeah. Just too many.
Yeah.
Yes, but your family, you didn't lose any of your family members?
No, fortunate enough, we were lucky not to, because all the children had been evacuated, and it was only the squire-knots were there. You know, like my mother, because my father was in the army, was called up, and then my brother, eldest brother, was called up in the Navy,
Yes.
and my other brother was on the verge of being called up, you know, in that period of time. And we just every night came, and you know, it just became a way of life, you know. And though we had complete lack of sleep, we came the next day. We managed to get up and go to work, regardless. And we managed to keep going through it all the time, being bombed night and day. Managed to get a bit of sleep or down in the tube trains, and the tubes continued running. People coming up, getting on and off, and we just decided when the people got off, a little passage left for them to walk through, and we were the side of them when the bombing started again that following night. And that went on for 8 months before the tide turned, and we won the battle. That's when the tide turned, and we won the battle of Britain. And that's why Hitler decided that it was too great a risk.
Yes.
What the strength of the Royal Navy, and the greatest disappointment at that time was when Churchill begged Marshal Pétain to carry the struggle on with the French fleet stationed in Africa, and Marshal Pétain refused to Churchill. He says, "You just as well surrender because they'll wring your neck like an old duck." And Churchill said, "Well, so be it." And he begged the French fleet to come over to carry on the struggle, but the admirals had given instructions to sail to the French ports, so Churchill had to make a decision. He reluctantly decided it was too big a risk to let the whole French fleet fall into German hands, so he opened fire and sank all the French fleet, and killing a few thousand of the French sailors, which the French have never forgiven us for it.
Okay, yeah.
And
would you say it was the right decision?
Well, it was definitely, without any shadow of doubt, a very hard decision to turn on the people that was your ally, and to do that was a hard decision. But at the end of the day, if the whole French fleet, Germany had got the whole fleet, it would have been a stronger navy, if not stronger, than the British Navy. And it would have made it definitely to hold the channel while the boats invaded England. It would have happened. he hadn't made that decision at that time.
What did you do in while the bombings, where the bombs were coming down, and you were in the shelters? How did you spend your time? I mean, did you just sit there, or did you have something to do?
We sat down. We actually prepared. We made flasks of tea.
Yeah.
And we had just a bit of bread, because ration was so tight, and we might have had a bit of cold chicken that was cooked, whatever. And we just, was just, we were actually on, but it only was barely kept alive at that period of time,
yes,
for the amount of food that we could eat. And in the meantime, I'd got a job with an engineering company, and we helped making the Bailey bridges.
Okay.
Which was the bridges that was across the Rhine with, and when we landed at Dunkirk, beg your pardon, when we landed in Normandy,
yeah,
helped, the bridges we built, and the equipment that we had was far in advance of anybody else had.
Okay. So, did you join, or did you get drafted into?
I volunteered. I was so full of hate, for the Germans, for what they'd been doing to us, and being completely innocent. I volunteered. I volunteered 3 months before I was due to be called up.
Okay.
And I wanted to be in the Air Force.
When was that?
That was the end of 1943.
Okay.
44.
Yeah. And you joined the Air Force,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay. As the flight engineer, or what was that?
I was joined as a flight engineer.
Yeah.
And that was my ambition, because I was already in engineering.
Yes. Okay. So that was kind of your passion, could you say that?
Well, it was my passion to be a bomber pilot and drop bombs on Germany.
Payback.
That's for payback.
Yeah.
That was my ambition.
Okay, so could you describe the training you went through, and or the basic training, what you did?
Well, the basic training was we used to call it square bashing, was marching up and down and drilling. Then after that it was assault courses, night schemes and 72-hour schemes with live ammunition, and it was a very, very tough period in that training. The training was exceptionally hard. It was, in fact, I would go as far as to say the training was 10 times harder and worse than the actual landing when we landed on Normandy.
You mean physically?
Physically and mentally.
Oh, okay.
It was that training you were absolutely driven to exhaustion.
Do you remember your unit, what it was called?
Yes, I was in the Air Force. I finished up in the basic Air Force. Then I was transferred to the Air Force Regiment, which was then formed, and I was trained in to help make airstrips for basic temporary airstrips for allowance to support of the fighter planes that back in the infantry.
Okay. And when was, you told me before that you had to switch to the army, right?
Yes, there was that period of time, and that's when we landed on Gold Beach. The first wave had gone in, and there was a few days afterwards we landed to build the airstrip.
So you were still in the Air Force then?
I was in the Air Force,
okay,
and landed in Normandy, yes.
Okay.
Still in the Air Force.
Did you know that you were going to France? Or
No,
when
it was all top secret. Well, we had an idea that we were going to invade Europe.
Yes.
But we didn't know when or when it was exactly the exact moment, because it was all kept secret.
You was a private, right?
I was only a private.
Yes. Okay. So maybe the officers knew it, and
Well, eventually, you know, there was given the secrets were opened up, and knew exactly what they were doing and what they were doing. But it was postponed for 24 hours because of the sea so rough.
yeah, it was supposed to be the 5th of June, right? I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
We didn't know to the last until we started getting on the ships. It's kept quiet, and the whole area was completely cut off from civilian, and it was just military and the whole area in Portsmouth, where we were stationed at the time.
Okay, so how can you describe the shipping out and what the how the model was back then?
Well, Eisenhower came and spoke to us, and Conway says, we're on this mission, and I know that a lot of you will never come back, but that the sacrifice you are making will never be forgotten.